Me, Hudza, Benjamin Perry, and Neo, we were like, yo, what if we made a diss track? Like, all these projects are too peaceful. We gotta bring some chaos into it. So we ended up writing a diss track on San Francisco.
Hello, and welcome back to episode 5 of Not a Minimum Viable podcast. We're here to bring you conversations with the builders, founders, and entrepreneurs who are shipping way more than just MVPs in Toronto's tech ecosystem. Each episode will dive deep into their journeys, from those early minimum viable products to the full-scale solutions they're building. Today we're joined by Flo, a Waterloo Biomedical Engineering dropout turned independent designer. Now based in Toronto, she crafts personal software with a passion for open sourcing creativity and believes effort always yields lessons in building a joyful life. Welcome to the podcast, Flo.
Yeah, thanks, Rudy. It's really cool to be on here with y'all. Manit,
Yeah.
pleasure meeting you as well.
Pleasure meet you as well. This is your first podcast, right? Like you said before. Do you listen to podcasts a lot? Because I feel like there's a difference between people who don't listen to podcasts actively and then they're on here and it's like a culture shock, I think, in some way. But
I'm curious what like the culture shock elements are.
I think there's a distinction you can notice in like how comfortable they feel on the mic or in the flow of the conversation. I felt that personally as well. I think it's like...
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, you're always listening to podcasts.
This is also true,
Yeah.
like constantly. Like I'm never not listening, because otherwise I'd have to listen to my thoughts and I'm not comfortable with that.
Yeah, let's tune it all out, you know? Yeah, I'd say one of my go-tos is, I always call it Deep Dive, but it's called Dive Club by Rid.
Okay.
He has a lot of great designers on, like Genuine from Anthropic, Henry Modisette from My Perplexity, and it's really cool to dive deep into how people approach design, like their own principles. Yeah, definitely recommend that.
Are you
one.
watching that on YouTube or are you listening to it?
I'm
Or do
usually listening to it on Spotify.
Oh, interesting. Because I feel like a theme like that, they could have like a video component as well, because a lot of podcasts are moving on YouTube now. But it's interesting.
Yeah, talking about design, do you maybe want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Okay,
some of the things you've been doing, where you're heading.
Cool, yeah. So, hey everyone, I'm Flo. I think my journey into design and now design engineering has been anything but conventional. Growing up, I was very STEM-pilled, you know. I never considered design like a viable career path because, you know, you could be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. And in 10th grade, I decided I didn't want to be a doctor. So I was like, next best thing, I'm going to go into engineering. And I got Waterloo pilled pretty early as well. They came to my high school for an open house in 10th grade. And I think what honestly sold me was the fact that they said only 20% of students graduate with any student debt. And I was like, okay, that's the place I'm headed. So that became like a very just like high level goal for the rest of my high school career. I was like the biggest physics nerd growing up. Like my dream job was to be a research scientist at CERN. I thought like particle physics was super cool, like high energy stuff. But I also figured that it wasn't a viable career path if I didn't go to grad school. And I was like, maybe engineering is the way to go. So that's how I ended up at Waterloo for biomedical engineering originally. But I think it was in actually the summer before Waterloo that I like came across design, and it was completely by accident. I was looking at Upper Year's portfolio websites, and there was this girl named Emily Louie, and she had worked on the COVID websites and apps for the Ontario Digital Service. And at the time, this was like peak COVID, you know, like everything was shut down. And this was kind of the moment that I realized that the tech that we use every day, like someone had to sit down and like create the opinions for what the interface should look like, how it should feel. And the fact that she, being like a first or second year student, was working on something being used by like millions of people around the province, I thought was really sick. So from that point forward, in like the summer before university, I started to look into design myself. So did a lot of like very scrappy projects following like YouTube tutorials, Medium articles. I made my own like very shitty website, but it was good enough to like get my foot in the door. And that's how I got into design, like with my first internship. I was a product designer with the Ontario government working on public tooling. And then after that, I worked in-house at a Series B construction tech startup for my second co-op. So also like UI UX design. And this is where I dropped out of Waterloo. So that's kind of like a whole other thread. But basically, when I left, I was like still doing design. I was doing like design part-time with like a COVID research dashboard. And yeah, after that, I worked as a chief of staff for a little bit under a year at a blockchain design company. Like I was also very into crypto for a period of time in my life, a bygone chapter. And yeah, like after I left that job, I was doing independent design. So I've been running an independent practice for the last couple of years. And just last year, I started to dip my toes into design engineering as well.
That's really cool. How do you, like, I'm assuming it takes a lot of, like, courage or conviction to decide that you want to drop the plan that you had made for yourself beforehand. Especially, like you said, that was something that was in your head from, like, an early age, right? So what does that move look like internally?
I think for me, it felt like something that I really needed to do. I felt like up until that point in my life, I had been following like the script. You know, like I think at Waterloo, there's a very strong mimetic culture of like Cali or bust, you know, like fang or nothing. And I think for a long time, I also wanted that like very much for myself as well. At Waterloo, I think my first year was like completely online, like during COVID, so I did school from home, and I only spent like 4 months on campus. But in those 4 months, I was like deeply miserable. Because I think part of it was just like not quite like discovering the groove of things. I was like super like, oh, I need to like work on school, but then I wasn't really into like party culture. So then maybe that like felt like there was some sort of like disconnect of just like myself and the community. Even though I would still be like super involved with like a lot of student orgs, like engineering society, tech organizations, hackathon organizing. And I think there just came a point where I realized that everything I was doing, when I asked myself why, like peeling back each layer, like, oh, why do I want to, like, why am I doing this job? Why am I doing design right now? Like, oh, I want to like work at this company. Why do I want to work at this company? Like, oh, I want to be like financially stable. Why do I want to be financially stable? Oh, it's always been like the right thing to do, and like I just want to be happy. So then I think there got to a point where I'm like, what actually makes me happy though? This was also the point where I got on Twitter. And I think that completely changed the trajectory of my life. Just meeting people who were doing things way off the beaten path, like teenagers raising millions of dollars to build their own companies, researchers in longevity and biotechnology, which I was also very interested in for a period of time. So I really like dove down those rabbit holes like very hard. And I actually went to San Francisco around this time as well, just to like get a general vibe check. And I think after a week there, I was like, okay, this is it. Like, I need to like take this leap of faith. Even though everyone was like, you're crazy. Like, what's your plan? I'm like, oh, you know, we're gonna figure it out as we go. So I booked my one-way flight and went on to, I think it was like, I forget, like Quest. Like it's kind of like their version of Acorn, like the student management stuff, and just dropped all my courses, and that was that. Yeah.
That is bold. I'm interested to know how that decision shaped like your own personal understanding of risk and like security when it comes to your future.
I think for me, like it almost felt like the like cost opportunity was really high of like, oh, if I just stay in school, I know exactly what's gonna happen. I'm gonna keep doing like school terms and work terms, school terms and work terms, and I'm gonna graduate and probably get a full-time job. But I was like, this is my chance to like see what's actually out there beyond the classroom. And it was pretty insane. Like I joined my full-time job about a month after living in SF, and like a few days later they flew me out to Seoul because the CEO and COO were there just for a bit. And then I was working between like East and Southeast Asia and North America for about a year. So it was like a very interesting role. I think I definitely learned a lot in terms of like what does life look like when you're no longer a student? Like what are the responsibilities in the real world? Like I think it really showed me like what was possible, but also gave me like a lot to think about in terms of what I actually value. Like I think part of the reason why I left at the end of the day was I missed doing IC work myself, like independent contributor work, because in this role felt like I was doing everything but. So like operations, both internal and external facing, a lot of like management and like organizing like build-a-thons and like panels, stuff like that. A lot of like top of funnel business development and growth. But I think at the end of the day, I was like, oh, if I ever want to build like a very strong hard skill set, it's probably the best time to do it. It's near early 20s.
Yeah, I've heard people say that, and when I say people, I mean the dudes on the YC YouTube channel say that this is, like this time of your life is probably the best time for you to take that risk and drop out if that's your meaning of risk, or choose this venture instead of a conventional path. So I think it's really interesting you chose that route. I wonder if any of your friends in Waterloo were inspired by you to do something similar.
It's a good question. I think, like, to be completely honest, when I left Waterloo, it was in like a very high strung emotional state. I was like full of expletives. I was like, I'm leaving, goodbye. And I think in hindsight there were a lot of lessons learned about how to leave things in a graceful way. Just looking at my 19-year-old self, I was like, that was not it. And I think a lot of my friends and people who knew me at Waterloo at the time were just like very shocked by this turn of events. And like my family, you know, everyone who knew me from high school, it was just completely off the rocker. So I think the biggest reaction was like concern and confusion.
I think that's fair. And I think that's what's so like appears daunting to me from the outside as well, is that you didn't have a direct exemplar, and like maybe you become that person for a lot of people afterwards, but like not having, or I'm assuming you didn't have a direct exemplar at least. And
Actually, there was a girl that I met off of Twitter. Her name is Anna Wang. I think she's a year or two older than me. And basically, we hopped on a call and she told me her story. She dropped out of Waterloo, like systems design engineering, with her sister, Jasmine Wang, who's from McGill. And they founded a company together, I believe that's called Copysmith. So this was before like ChatGPT, but like GPT-3 was out, like 3.5 maybe, I'm not too sure. But basically it was like a copywriting tool using AI. And they exited that company within like 6 months, and I think the sum was like considerable enough to be like, oh damn, like you can do that type of stuff.
Okay.
And she asked me like, oh, have you considered dropping out? And I was like, oh, me, never, like that's way too out there. But then like the more I thought about it, I was like, oh, like demographic wise, she's very similar to me, you know, she's like Chinese Canadian, grew up in like Edmonton, so like Western Canada. Like I'm from Vancouver, but I was like, oh wow, like looking at someone who did do like all of these things, who came from like some of a similar background, I was like, okay, it's not impossible. It's like all very much within the realm of what you can grasp.
That's pretty cool. But I think it helps, like having that kind of an exemplar or something of the sort to look up to.
For sure.
It's definitely a big bonus. But I'm also curious now, one thing, quick, like aside from your history, how did you and Rudy meet?
That's actually a good question. I feel like just through the Neo Toronto like Twitter sphere.
Yeah, I think the first time I saw you was at New Builds.
Oh really? Okay,
yeah.
Sick.
And then I was like, okay, this person exists, cool. And then you hosted personal software at 535.
Yeah.
That was where we like talked for the first time, and then I was like, cool, let's have her on the podcast.
And 535 is the one Sergey was saying has not shut down. Am I right?
Yes, they were going in a renovation, undergoing a renovation.
Yeah.
Wait, so it sounds like the Twitter space is like the underlying theme, I think, for most of our guests so far.
Oh yeah, and even Kalindi mentioned last week that you're always on the Twitter timeline because you're always like building something new. And he meant it as a compliment as well.
Oh yeah.
It's like terminally online.
No, it was the first name that popped into his head, I think, when we were asking about who's the most actively, I guess, pushing projects out. And
he mentioned your name. Yeah.
I'm honored. Kalindi is the best. But I feel like recently I haven't been like shipping as much. But yeah, means a lot to me. Yeah.
When you say not shipping as much, it kind of leads me to another question, right? Since you are within this like creative field, burnout must be a real thing, a very real thing. How do you deal with that, given that you have your own like designer agency?
I don't think about it as burnout so much as what is energizing for you. When I say I haven't shipped as much, it's more so like I haven't been tweeting as much recently.
I see.
But I have like an assortment of side projects that I like to dabble between. I'm just like, I need to actually finish one of them. I think a lot of it comes down to like doing work that you actually enjoy and like working with people that you like being around, because I think it feels a lot less than work, or a lot less like work when you do that.
So is that like a common theme that you look for, whether it's side projects or if you were looking for something professionally, that culture or the environment? Because for me, one of the reasons I'm not, I suppose, a big proponent of like typical business environments or a lot of the environments where students from my program end up going is because of the cultural dynamic that, you know, the priorities the people have there and the value that the work takes is different from what I want. And being in a supportive, creative environment where, you know, the people working around you have relationships with you, but the work itself is not the relationship you have with it. Like in corporate structures, right? Your relationship with the people who build that structure is real, but your relationship with the company itself is not real. It's an exchange. My question boils down to, does that environment or the culture that you want to put yourself into, is that something you're conscious of all the time when considering work?
I actually wanted to dive a little bit deeper into what you said about like that connection that you're feeling to the people versus to the work, and also like what values you feel like you're surrounded by and how you see that translate.
Well, so the thing is, one of the first pieces of advice somebody gave me when I was looking to get into like a professional field was that at the end of the day, you have a relationship with the people that you're working with there, right? Those are real human, tangible relationships. But everything else, specifically if you're working at a corporate and not your own startup, right, is an exchange. You're being compensated for your time and effort there. There is no moral or underlying like virtuous agreement that exists there that you're contributing towards the work. But I'm wondering if that's different if your primary driver is the work as opposed to, you know, the people environment.
I think the work and the people are very intimately intertwined. For me right now, I'm like thinking about the type of work that I'm doing like currently. Like I'm contracting with some like early stage startups doing design engineering, and part of what I find really fun about it is like it's early stage but also structured enough so that it's not like completely all chaos. Like in terms of the type of work that I've done, when I first started doing design independently, I would work with another design engineer, and basically we would do brand and web primarily, like some product but less so. And I think with that, for a long time it felt like I would do design and like that was what people knew me for, but it was almost like my heart wasn't fully in it. And I think last year there was more of a shift of like really coming to appreciate the craft of design and like enjoying the process as opposed to just getting to the output. I've since been working more independently, so like less as this like design engineer duo since last year. And I think what's been rewarding in that sense has been learning how to like build things and like ship them to prod as well, because when I'm building like my own personal projects, like you know like or hopefully like you have a good lay of the land in terms of what's going on in your code base, but when you're like entering someone else's like repo or like contributing to a larger project, it's been really interesting to like navigate those intricacies as well. I don't think this answers the exact question that you posed, but some like rambly thoughts.
No, I think that makes sense. My question was very rambly as well to begin with. But what you said in the beginning about the work and the people being intertwined, I think I get that because, you know, depending on the environment that you're in or the people that you're working in, it obviously gets translated into the work you're doing and what your day-to-day looks like. So like you were saying, working with a design and design engineer duo for you as a duo is different than when you're working individually. Do you find yourself like taking over both roles and, you know, it's like one part of you is contributing to the design side and one part of you is acting as the design engineer? Or do you think it kind of like meshes into this one person?
Yeah, I feel like now that I'm also doing implementation work, it's definitely changed the way that I design from when I first started off, because the further removed you are as a designer from understanding the underlying processes and technologies, like the more you're going to miss in terms of edge cases, like states, like the main considerations that you need to have. Whereas if you're the one that needs to like translate everything, I think it's a much more integrated approach, and it gets you to think more deeply about what is the actual intention of this like flow or this product. And I think having that like holistic top-down view is really helpful as like someone who started off purely in design.
Yeah, I feel like it's similar to, what's like forward or backward integration from a point, and it's essentially like zooming out and you're expanding your skill set, but also your perspective. And that's kind of cool, I think, in like most spaces. So a lot of consultants like try to get into product because, or going to like the private side of things when they don't see that projects getting to fruition or being implemented and they miss that part of it. So essentially they take up the forward integrated role in that pipeline as well.
I think there's one more thing to point out here. In like larger organizations and enterprises, your attachment to the work is quite different than if you were like an independent designer, for example, or working at your own startup, or at like in a smaller team as a whole. Because what I've noticed is people at startups, they care a lot more about the product that the company's delivering compared to larger enterprises. And I think there's a parallel to be drawn between that and the work you're doing as like an independent designer, because in that case, every like project that you work on is like almost like there's a parallel there. I don't know if I'm conveying that properly.
I would assume a lot more of you and your personality gets imbued into those projects, right, as opposed to you working on a task.
I think that's a really interesting point to question, because oftentimes when I'm working on projects, I feel like they look like visually there's like many different directions in the work, right? For a period of time, like a lot of my clients were coming from like DeFi and like blockchain and crypto, just because that was the space I'd worked in for a couple of years, and they want like a somewhat consistent feel. And I think a lot of pushing yourself in design is considering what does it look like to like set new creative directions as opposed to just following what's already been determined. There's this analogy that a friend and I came up with about a year ago called like crabs in design. The story is we were going for a walk and talking about like the new linear homepage that had just shipped, because I think this was like 2024, like back in 2022, when every website looked like the OG linear site, like purple, gradients, dark mode, lights. It became something that when you looked at a website, it was less so like, what was the inspiration here? More like, oh, this looks like all of these other websites I've already seen, right? And I think something that really stuck with me about what this friend said was, like, when you look at a website like linear, don't ask like, how do I make something like this? Ask like, what was their inspiration to like create this sort of creative direction, and how did everything come from there, like downstream? And in biology, there's this concept called carcinization, in which many different organisms converge to the form of a crab just because it's evolutionarily advantageous, right? So like different lineages, but then they all have like these pincers, the body's kind of oblong shaped, like these little legs. And then I was like, yo, that's kind of like these landing pages. Like when you take something to be like just the sum of what it is and nothing more, then you lose like the underlying essence of it. And I think after conversations like this, I started to like think more deeply about what is the like concept that you want to communicate, or like what is the intention or ideal. I think it's very different as well when you're working on like brand forward versus like product forward projects. Like one of the projects I'm working on right now is called Paradigm AI. They use like agent cells as an interface for LLMs. And for this, like the brand has largely been established, so I'm mostly working on like product engineering. Whereas for other projects, it's been very much like creative direction. So I think seeing brand as an instantiation of, or like seeing product as an instantiation of brand is also an interesting way of looking at it. It's like not just how it looks, but like how it feels, like what the animations look like, the easings, so on and forth.
Yeah, the ethos of the brand and the product existing like together. I think Apple, to me, for the longest time felt like the monolith or the biggest example of that, because of the work that Johnny Ives did under Steve Jobs, and how like it was all directed through what the user should be feeling or what they should be experiencing, and that culminates in what the brand of Apple is eventually. I think that it's an interesting concept about whether or not you lose the essence through the step process. I think I was showing you this YouTube video the other day, or like a while back, about this guy where he took a painting and then he made a YouTube video inspired by it, and then he sent that to another artist who had a different medium, but he only got the second stage inspiration. and then one more stage and one more stage, and he was just trying to see what of the essence of the original inspiration stays throughout the process, right? And I thought that was like a pretty cool thought exercise, and a lot of brands through iterations can also feel like that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
People often say in design that design is a lot more than just how something looks and feels, but it's also about how the product like works in a way. In your work, have you ever like had an opportunity to interact with design when it comes to product itself rather than look and feel?
When you say interact with product itself, I'm curious, is this more at a high level understanding the overarching flow and how the user interacts with it?
I think more so about how like the product behaves at like the core level.
I think these are questions that I'm more often exploring through personal projects. I think with a lot of the projects I do for work, in the past, like with Brandon Web, it's like fairly straightforward. It'll be like a marketing site and like creative direction. Whereas with like some of the personal projects that I'm tinkering with these days, I'm like asking myself how opinionated an interface should be, or like what does the flow look like, or what makes sense here. Someone who comes to mind who I feel exemplifies like design is how it works is Raphael Shad, the maker of like Cron, now Notion Calendar. Like I really look up to his work, and there's like YouTube videos of him with Gary Tan like walking through his sketching process, and even though it's like pen on paper, the level of fidelity of thought is like so high in terms of thinking, oh, when the mouse is here, like this is the state that it should translate into, and like thinking through all of those like edge cases and minutia. I feel like when you're designing a product from scratch, having that like high level idea of like, oh, what is the intention of this project, right? Like with Cron, I remember him describing it as software that should feel like a Swiss timepiece. So what's the level of like precision that comes across in that type of work?
I think this is like keeping the overarching feel in mind, right? Something that we've discussed with our previous guests and we've talked about otherwise also is the importance of storytelling in tech projects or startups in general. But what does that translate to for you in design specifically?
Oftentimes when I'm making projects for myself, like personal software, the question that I start off with is like, how do I want the user of this to feel? Or like, what am I trying to capture through this product? Recently, I've been playing with tools anchored around the concept of like memory and archives, and also like personal relationships. How can you create a tool that represents like what they mean to you, right? Like I've been playing around with this metaphor of like all the people in your life as plants in a garden. So what does it look like to like keep track and like tend to all these individuals that you care about? Like, for example, if you hang out with someone and you want to jot down like something that resonated with you, or if you just like learned their birthday, you want to like write it down. Like my current system is I have Apple Notes, and then the title will just be like that person's name, and then just like whatever I want to remember. And then I'll record like birthdays in Google Calendar, but I'm like, oh, what if it were integrated? So the underlying feeling is, how can I create a sense of like connection and like responsibility towards these people that I love?
That's such a cool idea though, like just as a concept, because you can keep adding layers to it. That's so cool, because you know some people are you could be a cactus, or somebody could be a different kind of plant, because different friendships or relationships require different kind of involvements or different effort and different levels of work to, you know, quote unquote nurture them.
I've seen this like theme of personal connections with your work quite a bit for the past couple of months. I want to know what your inspiration behind this is. Like, is there something that's been driving you into looking into personal connections more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, a lot of the inspiration from my work comes from like what I'm thinking about. And there came a point in my life where I realized that like the single most important thing for like what feels like a fulfilling life is like fulfilling relationships and fulfilling work, right? So I think relationship wise, when I think about the moments that I feel the most alive, it's oftentimes like with people that I love. So when I'm like designing or like building tools, I'm just like, oh, what's something that I could make to like gift to someone? I like to joke that my love language is sending and receiving .vercel.apps, you know? Like if I watch a movie with someone and they have a little favorite character, what if I made a little dashboard just to capture this for them and then send it over as a surprise? Or what would it look like if I made a digital letter with an envelope that would snap and, you know, they can like replay it and stuff like that. So I think thinking about like making and creation as a love language is something that really resonates with me, for like your friends, your family, so on and so forth.
This next question is a bit, I guess, of a jump again to a different topic, but we were talking earlier about the Toronto tech ecosystem, right? And your involvement there specifically as well. How important has that space been for you in terms of, you were saying you've not been posting as much recently, right? But are there periods when you feel more motivated to post, when you don't want to share some stuff? And then how important has that platform been for you and your development so far?
Yeah, I feel like the Toronto, like Neo Toronto community has been a huge part of my life for the last couple of years in Toronto, because it really started popping off like a little bit over a year ago, actually, with Tommy and Vin and like new demos. I think the way that I view it now is this entourage of like familiar faces, these characters that you have in your life, and I truly feel so lucky and privileged to get to be a witness to it and to get to create things alongside people that I care about and look up to so much. I think one way that Tommy put it really well is that we get to be friends with our heroes, and seeing all of these different friends like cook in their own ways, like Kelly with design events, Omar with his music events, Kalindi and Matul, like seeing everyone create and contribute to this shared canon, I think is so incredibly rewarding. It's like world building that you're doing collectively.
Are there any elements from that Neo Toronto, I guess, community that you've been a part of that you think have like slowly creeped up in your design work and are reflected through that medium?
That's a good question. I feel like a lot of the themes I see in the Neo Toronto community has been like interdisciplinary creation, like going beyond just technology. I like how with things like New Stadium, you know, at the recent New Works in Progress event, it wasn't just technology and software. We had people drawing comics, we had people writing books, like artists, so on and so forth. I think trying to, like, if you are in technology, looking around and taking inspiration from the world around you is so powerful, because at the end of the day, like, software is a form of storytelling. So looking around and thinking, what are the interesting ways that these fields could intersect, right? Like, if you're super into like urban planning, like Rishi is, what does it look like to make a piece of software that creates the level of change and empowerment that you want to see across like city development? Or if you're really into like music, what does it look like to create tools for musicians or artists?
Within the design space of that specifically for you, I guess this is more opinionated, I guess. Is there something you've been seeing recently that you've been wowed by, or you've been tracking or following really closely that you think is like a interesting change or movement and, you know, could be prominent in the next few years?
I think the first thing that comes to mind are all of these different pieces of like UI generation or like code generation tools. It's been really fascinating to see it unfold across the last couple of years, especially as someone who started off very non-technical and just got into writing code by asking, using natural language, right? Like when I first started playing around with tools like V0 by Versatile, I was just blown away by how much I could get by just like asking and tweaking and prompting and like exporting into my own code base, but then figuring out by having this like infinitely patient, credit consuming the tutor, right? I think it's been a huge shift in what people can accomplish, and with the movement of quote unquote like personal software and like home cooked tools, seeing people who are traditionally non-technical, like those in marketing or sales or, you know, design, being able to create like functional prototypes, I think is really interesting. But also acknowledging that there is a ceiling that you hit with these tools as of right now. Like as the models keep getting better and like context windows get better, we'll see some improvement, but underscoring the importance of understanding to a certain extent like what you're building is also like very important as well. I think for me, like there has been points where I'm trying to refactor code and I'm like, oh, I actually have no idea what this does. And then needing to go back of like, okay, I want to like rebuild this project from scratch, essentially, just like where I'm writing like all the, like maybe not writing all the functions, but at least I have a much deeper like ingrained feel for how everything interacts and how all the pieces come together, because I think otherwise you're just like stitching together like pieces of a quilt with fabric that you found on the ground. I think there's a difference between treating these tools as like code vending machines versus a partners in thought or like a co-author sometimes. It's also been interesting to create that delineation between like when is the right time for vibe coding versus when should you be a little bit more diligent with how things are structured.
You mentioned you started off not knowing how to code, right? So as you've like progressed through, I guess, all these like stages of learning more and more, how have you like measured your own growth through these different stages? And it doesn't necessarily have to like correspond to coding as such, but it could be throughout like your career, for example.
I think in terms of measuring growth, it's like checking in with past versions of yourself, like, oh, what could I do a month ago or like 6 months ago or a year ago, and then looking at that like huge contrast, I think can be really rewarding, because it's really easy to forget, like, oh, 1 year ago, I didn't know how to do this at all. Like 3 years ago, I could barely design a website. And like really looking at your work from more of a removed like perspective, I find can be really helpful, because when we're stuck in the day to day, you don't really feel the progress even if it is happening.
I think that's what like Kalindi was talking about, where he every year goes back and tries to rebuild a Pomodoro timer from scratch, and he like compares how much improvement he's seen in his own like ability or skill.
I think having that like one point to compare or look back at is extremely helpful, because like especially now when like how much people are like posting on Twitter about all this cool stuff they're doing. You have 15-year-olds raising like 20 mil or something like that. Like it's easy to get lost in all of that and feel like you haven't made progress. But when you look at it objectively, like because everybody starts at a different point compared to where you were before, it's always a good like way to estimate your own growth.
I feel like that's definitely a trap people like can fall into when you're such an ingrained part of a community where everyone has like a similar drive or motivation and they're pushing products, right? And like Kalindi was saying, you're one of the people who's most active and you're pushing a lot of products out. But for people who are not necessarily doing it as quickly or at such a pace, I was reading somebody's essay earlier, and one of the quotes in there was, and it feels like everybody's in Paris. And I was like, yeah, that's your algorithm basically placing you in a small silo, and you kind of lose that perspective. And do you experience that at any point? And if so, like, how do you go about like removing from that? How do you take that step back?
Yeah, I think there was definitely a period of time where I was very hooked on that dopamine rush of like, oh, I'm gonna crank something out in 12 hours and like slap it on twitter.com, all the reacts are coming in, wow, this feels great. But then I would never return to those projects, right? Because recently I've been thinking a lot more of what does it mean to have longevity in your work? What does it mean to make something that feels heavy, as Anu put it in her Substack? I think in the past I would have an idea and it would be a challenge to myself, like how much can I build in 12 hours? And then just like sit down and lock in, and that would be that. But I think beyond the surface level a satisfaction of like making something very hacky that like kind of works, there's a level of like appreciation for depth in your work as well. And I think that's something that you're not necessarily able to get if you're just shipping like very surface level things, which I was doing for like some period of time. And I think right now I've like switched gears a little bit. The way I like to think about it is that everything comes in seasons. Some seasons you're going very broad, you're making things quickly, you're seeing what feels right, and in other seasons you want to slow down. And I think that one is not inherently better or worse than the other. It's more so understanding what are you trying to get out of this chapter of your life right now.
I also wanted to ask, like, in a similar flow of things, right? What is your vision then for your design work that you're doing, like your independent agency or the contract work that you're doing? Because you're talking about longevity here. Has that vision changed since you started that work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, like when I started doing design independently, I never really went into it like, oh, I want to make like a huge agency, or like I want to scale to X amount of MRR. Like you do see a lot of those types of posts online as well. I think for me it was more so like it was almost by like accident that I fell into a lot of these things. I think sometimes that's a common theme of my life where I look at where I am now. I'm like, oh, I never would have seen this coming. Like, I'm just as surprised as you are. Is I think oftentimes like feeling follows action, right? Like, even if you start doing work and you don't like love it, or like you're doing it because you're curious, right? But then the better you get at it, the more satisfying it becomes. And I think where I'm at right now is I want to work more on like craft and making things I feel proud of. I really love the breadth that I get from my work with clients, you know, getting to work on like a very large variety of things, touching different industries, different types of products. But I'm also looking forward to finding more depth in that as well. So, for example, like this summer, I'll be working at Bristol as a design engineer, and it's the first time I'll have a manager in like 3-4 years, and I'm very, very excited. So I think when you're working on your own, there's like so much that you don't know, right? Like where your blind spots are, where the biggest like points of leverage can be. I think it's very easy to get lost in echo chambers of your work, and then the client's looking towards you to provide that direction, right? So I'm very excited to just be in rooms where I know I'll be like the least experienced person, or like I know I have a lot of people to look up to, and soaking up as much as I can to make the most of that learning opportunity as well.
Yeah, with this, let's move on to the next segment. This is something we do with pretty much all of our guests.
Sweet.
And it's a way for us to learn more about you as a person outside of the work you've been doing. We call these rapid fire questions, but realistically, you can take your time with them.
They're just questions, but yeah, there's nothing rapid about them, as you'll find out. So, first off, what is your go-to comfort meal after a long, busy day of work?
Okay. This is something that I eat often. I don't know if I would classify it as a comfort meal, but it is comforting to me. Basically, you take a scoop of protein whey isolate.
You have me hooked on.
God.
And you put it in a bowl with an egg. Like, you mix that up, and maybe add some water, and then you put it in the microwave.
I know where you're going with this.
And what I love to do is like I'll take frozen berries and like, you know, put it in, and I'll microwave for about like 40-50 seconds, so when it comes out, like the edges are set like a souffle, but the inside is like nice and gooey. And then sometimes I'll put Greek yogurt on it. I'll put like chopped dark chocolate, like peanut butter.
Wow.
I eat that a lot.
This sounds like microwave cake, but with, you know, for
Pretty
Jack
much,
people.
yeah.
It's a good breakfast food.
Gotta try it out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
would
I figured
recommend.
you would, yeah.
Gotta get like chocolate, like I use PVL, protein whey isolate.
Oh, nice.
So, highly recommend. Yeah.
Cool. Would you rather spend a day tinkering with like a design tool like V0 or creating YouTube videos in a cabin in the wood?
I think just because I'm quite familiar of what it looks like to sit at your laptop for 12 hours, I'm going to take the YouTube video Cabin in the Woods.
Oh.
Also, I used to make like YouTube videos when I was back at Waterloo. It's been a hot minute, but I'd love to get back into it at some point. Yeah.
What would be the kind of video that you would go back into it with?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm of multiple veins of thought here. Some of them I'm curious to like go on adventures with like friends and then kind of like capture that of like, oh, what's the craziest thing you can do in like X amount of time? Like, how far can you go with a plane ticket or whatever? I think it would also be really cool to like interview some of my friends. I think they've done really incredible things, and like see what type of artifacts I can create with that, or just like capturing moments of the day to day. Something else I'm really curious about is like, what does it look like to have more conversations on like craft and what that means? Like, there's all these buzzwords of like taste, craft, so on and so forth, but like when you deconstruct it, like, what are the fundamentals that we look towards, and how can we capture and communicate that?
Okay, what is the most random thing you've ever built just for fun? This doesn't have to be a work project, but it could be.
Yo, I'm gonna say the Don't Drain music video. So for context, during new builds, the hackathon where I met Rudy last year, the prompt was something to do with like, how can you make the city gray, or like blah blah blah. And then me, Hudza, Benjamin Perry, and Neo, we were like, yo, what if we made a diss track? You know, like all these projects are too peaceful. We gotta bring some chaos into it. So we ended up writing, with the help of, you know, Suno and some AI tools, a diss track on San Francisco.
Oh.
and why the real ones stay and build in Toronto, even though we're all guilty of going to the US. But it was a lot of fun, you know, just to build it. Like Donald Dukes did the cinematography, and it was just amazing. Like we sat on the top of Ben's red Tesla, you know, red for Canada. Like Ben had this like Tim Hortons MasterCard that had to like put between his teeth, and he was like, wifey's credit card on lock. I think that was like one of the randomest, most random yet like core memory-esque days I've ever had.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was a very surprising reveal. I remember that much. If you could have dinner one-on-one with anybody, dead or alive, who would it be?
This is a good question. I feel like the first person that came to mind was Raphael Shab, but that's just because we mentioned him earlier, so I think it's like a recency bias.
But that's a valid answer.
Yeah.
And I gotta come clean. I was listening to his podcast, like his episode on YC, like right before this podcast to prepare.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is your guilty pleasure tech gadget that you can't live without?
A tech gadget.
Yeah, or an app or a tool. These questions were written in 2005. So, yeah.
Nice, you guys found them on a list online. Sweet. My guilty pleasure is just watching like logistics videos on YouTube.
What do you mean logistics though?
Like sometimes I'll get bored and open up like Wendover Productions and then spend 20 minutes learning about the logistics of airports and like shipping.
Okay.
Like shipping route.
There's nothing wrong with that. CNBC makes some great videos.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Okay, what's one app or tool you think is totally underrated?
Underrated. The first thing that came to mind was granola, but like everyone's talking about it, so it's not underrated. For context, granola is like an AI note-taking tool that just has better vibes than the alternatives like Firefly AI, which I also use. Underrated. I'm gonna need to like pause and think on that one.
It's cool. We can cut out the silence.
You should like build add-ons to granola AI with, you know, berries and yogurt.
Beautiful.
I will cut this out. Don't worry about it.
Oh, actually, I started using Futureland again recently, like Futureland 2. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it's made by this guy named Internet Bin. It's a staple pillar in the Neo-Toronto community. And it's basically a habit tracker for your entire life.
No?
So today I woke up at like 4 a.m. and I started just like journaling in Futureland. I was like, oh, here's like my lucid or somewhat lucid like train of consciousness. And then I went to the gym and like went on the incline treadmill for 45 minutes just like writing. So I do recommend Futureland. It's like very handy. Good to track your life. Yeah.
Okay, if you could instantly master any skill overnight, what would it be?
The first thing that came to mind was like being the best like learner that you can. Like how can you just absorb information and like utilize it in a way that reaches a very deep level of understanding. But something else I've been wondering about is like, why are some people just like so funny? Like what is it about them that, you know, it's so comfy and humanizing? I feel like everything is just a skill issue, so I'm sure, you know, if you put in the reps, you too can be skillful and funny.
Agreed, yeah. If you can't be funny, do what you can't. Become funny.
Yeah. This next question's interesting because I think you mentioned something along this line previously as well. But if you could go back and give advice to yourself when you were just starting your tech career, what would you say? What would it be?
I would say to like humble yourself. Not that I had a like, I don't know, big fat ego or anything, but I think it's more so like you're not above anything. Like whenever you're starting off in a field, like understand that this is the worst you'll ever be, and even if everything seems very daunting, like there's ways to figure it out, especially now in the age that we live in, you know. I think the more that you ask, the more that you get out of the world. So just like continue pushing.
As one of the greats put it, be humble.
Yeah.
Sit down.
If your life was a movie, what would it be titled?
You know that series, like the series, a series of unfortunate events? It wouldn't be unfortunate, but like a series of
Events.
accidents. Like Flo bumbles around the world.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
Okay, this last question is probably the most important one. Cats or dogs?
I'm gonna say dogs. You know.
Now this podcast can finally make it onto the air. Otherwise, I would have binned it, honestly.
With that, we come to the end of this episode. Thank you for joining us, Flo. Before we leave, do you have anything you'd like to say to the people
A
listening?
nugget of advice to our thousands and thousands of listeners.
Beyond like stream the podcast on every platform, support Rudy and Manit. I would say to like do what you don't think you're capable of yet. Like the only way that you're going to get to where you want to be is if you live life as if you're already there. It's one way I like to think about it. If you like carry yourself with the sense of like, I don't really know how I'm gonna get there, but I know I will. Good things will happen to you.
Thank you for listening, everyone. Thanks for being here, Flo.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a lot of fun.